Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. This is the Intel update for March 2nd through the 8th, 2025. So let's get right to it. Right up front, let's start with everyone's favorite topic, trade disputes. I know, not the most exciting topic to cover, however, this is probably going to be somewhat impacting at the grocery store over the next few weeks if things continue on as they have been. So far, most of the rhetoric between the United States, Canada, and Mexico has largely remained the same. Every party involved is fairly entrenched in their positions. However, the United States has started to give the indications and warnings that they're willing to back down, or at least the White House has kind of floated these ideas of some sort of reconciliatory trade deals or something like that. At the moment, however, most trade between the United States and Canada and between the United States and Mexico is subject to a 25% tariff. Going back on previous agreements, there have been some carve-outs for some kinds of goods between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, similar to the old NAFTA years. It's really random which goods are going to be impacted by the trade tariffs or by being carved out or exempted from the trade tariffs, so I guess we'll just kind of have to see how that works out. But it is important to note that the 25% tariff is not a blanket tariff. It's on most things, but there are some things that are carved out. For now, it's just important to note that the tariffs are going ahead as planned. So what have Canada and Mexico done in response? Well, mostly Canada has been driving the show here and pushing back a little bit more on the United States than Mexico, mostly because Canada has the ability to push back just the tiniest bit more than Mexico. Mexico's economy is almost entirely and completely reliant on the United States, so they really don't have any negotiating room almost at all. However, Canada does have a little bit more leeway, especially in the national defense space or territorial, defense space. So Canada has a lot of Arctic wilderness, and they have a lot of say in things like NORAD and the shared North American airspace defense. So if Canada wants to get squirrely, they can bring a little bit of inconvenience, a little bit more inconvenience than Mexico, for instance. Mostly Canada and Mexico have essentially copied each other's homework with regards to what they're doing to push back on the White House, and mostly it's in the form of reciprocal tariffs. However, in Canada's case, it's quite interesting because Canada has, or at least Trudeau, has really kind of done a whole lot of wordsmithing, because it turns out that if Canada were to enact reciprocal tariffs on the United States, say a 25% tariff on most goods, Canada would have to lower their tax rate, because it turns out, most people are finding out, again, that Canada has had much higher tariffs on the United States than the other way around. For instance, Canada has had a roughly 250% tariff on things like dairy products, milk, and I think eggs also have a very high tariff between the United States and Canada. So again, if Canada wanted to enact a reciprocal tariff, they're going to have to lower their tax rate, because we are tariffing them at 25% on some things, and they are tariffing us at 250% on some things. So that's kind of an interesting little tidbit there, which is why you're seeing a lot of Canadian politicians kind of hem and haw back and forth on what to do, because, well, Canada's politicians have kind of put them in a tight spot. Mexico has done something sort of similar, really in terms of pushing back against the United States. Mexico has a little bit more leeway to impact things like fruit, so they can tariff fruit and produce imports into the United States, and they can also cause a little bit of trouble with things like car parts. Auto manufacturing relies a lot on the facilities in Mexico to make cheap car parts. So when it comes to trade deals, that's pretty much what's kind of going on right now, and that's how kind of things kind of stand. However, there is an unspoken aspect to all of this, which is becoming a lot more openly spoken over the past few weeks, especially from the White House or Trump's own statements, like during press briefings and things like that, is the element of crime. So obviously, one of Mexico's chief resources is organized crime. Mexico is, I know that it may be inflammatory to say, but Mexico is a textbook narco state. They are influenced very, very heavily by the assortment of cartels that essentially put all of their politicians into power, right? Every time an election rolls around, you have mass murders of anyone who is running against the cartel. So no one can get elected in Mexico from the lowest level all the way up to the top of the highest office without some sort of deal, being made, or more likely a selection of deals. So when Mexico says they're going to push back with things like fruit and things like car parts, well, that's just the kind of white market, that's the open things they can talk about. What they were really trying to insinuate is, well, we're just going to make your life a little bit more difficult with the cartels. So how is this happening? Well, Mexico can just turn a blind eye to a lot of the things that, in terms of security on the border, they can encourage things, they can actively help things quite a bit. They can make life a little bit more difficult in the short term, maybe in the long term too, I don't know. But that's going to be a harder thing to assess. Something that's been a little bit more mentioned, I guess, a little bit more discussed, is what's going on in Canada with regards to the border security situation there. So once again, the dispute between the United States and Canada, it's about trade, but it's also about border security. One of the things that the White House, especially once Trump took over, mentioned is that Canada is allowing a lot of drugs to come in through the northern border, especially things like fentanyl precursors, which are shipped in from China. Canada turns a blind eye, and there's a pretty big drug trade in Canada. You might not think about it, but it is. So a lot of drugs come into the United States through Canada. A lot of the higher grade prescription kind of drugs or precursors to make things like fentanyl come in through Canada, come in through New York, and there you go. Interestingly enough, a lot of the smaller little side comments that President Trump has made, if we're going to pick apart smaller comments, one of the things that has become increasingly noticeable is the White House, Trump specifically, really just pointing the finger at Canada, saying, hey, look, you guys are not doing all you can to prevent drugs and immigrants, also a lot of Indian immigrants come in through Canada, from coming across the border, which I find to be very interesting. So this whole trade dispute thing is not just about economic fairness and reciprocal tariffs. There's also an element of border security to it and national security to it. So I guess we'll just kind of have to see how that works out in the long run. So that's pretty much how things stand right now at the border with regards to Canadian and Mexican trade tariffs. There's not really a whole lot to sink our teeth into, but there is the general assessment out there. It's not just my own assessment, but most people tend to think that these trade tariffs are not going to be in effect for too long. This is more of a negotiating tactic than anything else. However, personalities do matter, right? So, this could go on for a lot longer than people might want to think it will. It's definitely not a bluff. I don't know why a lot of people tend to think the White House is bluffing. They're not bluffing. They're telling you policy decisions. So you can say that's good or bad. It's up to you to decide. But this is definitely not a bluff because these things have come into fruition. So we'll have to kind of see how long this plays out. Also in Canada, I wanted to briefly mention something that occurred last night because I didn't have time. It occurred after the wire went out, and I wanted to talk about it because it's an interesting case. This was the case of a mass shooting at a restaurant in Scarborough. Now, this is the shooting that took place at the Piper Arms pub in Toronto, or more specifically Scarborough, the district of Toronto there. Of course, the situation is still developing. This is a very dynamic situation. There's not a whole lot of details that are confirmed. However, the general story is that 3 armed men wearing disguises and entered the establishment, the Piper Arms pub there, and started shooting randomly. Now, what's the most interesting part about this is that the pub had just opened, so this was opening night for that pub. This particular area has been a little bit run down in the past. This pub has kind of been renovated, and it went out of business, and it's kind of just gotten its feet under it again, and it had on opening night a mass shooting incident, which I found to be very interesting. Also interesting is that no one was killed, at least not as of this report, right? So 6 people were wounded, so there were 6 people that actually received gunshot wounds, and there were 6 more people, depending on which news story you read, there were 6 more people that were injured. My guess, just speculating here, is that could have been broken glass, debris, physical ailments, medical condition, pre-existing medical conditions. These kinds of things tend to happen, so when you see a news report that has 6 gunshot wounds and then, another number of wounded or injured, it depends on how the whole situation worked out. But interestingly enough, most of the mainstream media articles that I have found on this say that no one suffered even life-threatening injuries. So you've got 3 gunmen with what are assessed to be rifles, at least that's what the mainstream media says. 3 dudes with rifles go into a restaurant, spray the place down with gunfire, and no one even gets seriously hurt. So this is very interesting to me. I don't understand, one, why there aren't more casualties. I know it's kind of morbid, thought, but generally speaking, you would think there would be more. However, there weren't. And also the context of the local area is very important too. My first thought when I was reading about this is, who's going to attack, like an Applebee's. Like, this makes no sense. Hold the place up, rob it. Okay, fine. But mass shooting at a restaurant is pretty rare. So I thought, oh, okay, well, maybe there's some kind of connection with the owner. Maybe it's some kind of organized crime or a hit job or something. I don't know. Well, it's harder to kind of get a beat on this because this is a chain, a franchise. So it's owned mostly by Indians, and it's in a heavily Indian and Chinese district of Toronto. If you pull up the population demographics, you can see that the overwhelming majority of people who live in this area are Chinese or Indian, of Asian, East Asian, West Asian, South Asian descent. So I don't know, maybe there's something to it with that. I don't know if this is factional violence or if this is some kind of family deal, but it doesn't necessarily look like straight up terrorism. But again, this is all very speculative, and there's not a whole lot of details. It could have been a terrorist attack, but generally speaking, you would think that it would have worked out a little bit differently, especially considering that the gunman got away. So they had a getaway vehicle, a silver car, and once they were done shooting at the place, they left, which is odd for terrorism. Usually they have some sort of death wish kind of thing. So it's hard to say what actually happened, but I guess we'll have to wait and see what details come out from this. But right now, that's pretty much all I have. Moving now to the southeast region, I want to mention the Epstein docs essentially have died on the vine. There's really been nothing new, to quite literally no one's surprise. However, there is still a very large media blitz out there about it. Most of the influencers who took part in the Binder scandal have kind of just not quite disappeared, but they've kind of been laying low on the topic for a while after they realized that this was a very big outrage kind of thing. The Attorney General has mostly been doing Fox News interviews for the past few days, or since this whole scandal broke out, with really nothing new. So, I don't know. I don't think we're going to get anything. I don't think anybody really expected anything. It's just impressive that this was a very big media blitz. This was a big campaign issue for one. This was a very big scandal, and I don't think anyone was actually expecting anyone involved in this entire scandal to really face justice. But I think that you're going to explicitly tell us that you're going to release a lot of things, and nothing has happened. So it would have been a lot different, like I wrote in The Wire. It would have been a lot different if they had just said, well, there's ongoing investigations. We can't let this out because we're planning to prosecute these people. Even if they did that or said that and then just didn't prosecute anyone for a few decades, it would have been unfortunate, but I don't think it would have been surprising for anyone. But to come out and explicitly say, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and then immediately renege on those promises within 24 hours, that's a hard thing for people to swallow. So either way, I don't think very many people are going to be impressed with whatever phase 2 looks like. There hasn't been any talk about phase 2 release of any sort of documents, although the DOJ, the Attorney General, has stated that whatever is released will be redacted, so we know how that goes. But anyway, just wanted to kind of keep that fresh in everyone's mind for those of you who have not been following it, and the rather unfortunate way that that's kind of worked out. Another incident that occurred this week, which I found to be very interesting, was down in Florida. There were 3 separate civilian aircraft violations of the closed airspace surrounding President Trump's residence at Mar-a-Lago. This occurred last week, actually on Saturday. These airspace violations resulted in F-16s scrambling from the 1st Air Force out of Tyndall Air Force Base. And what's kind of interesting in this case is that during at least 2 of these interceptions, the military aircraft had to deploy flares to get the attention of these civilian pilots. This is a very interesting case because over the years, an increasingly pertinent problem within civilian aviation is complacency. I've had a lot of pilots tell me about this and talk about this. I know a little bit about aviation here and there. And one of the cultural things that has become more of a concern is problems with the international distress frequency. Now, I do not know the details of these specific interceptions, but I can speak generally on how these things work. So during the military interception of civilian aircraft who are violating like national security airspace, one of the very first steps is to make contact via radio with the offending aircraft. So it's going to depend a lot on standard operating procedure, or SOP, for whichever military unit is doing the interception. However, generally speaking, most military pilots will try to contact that civilian aircraft on the international distress frequency of 121.5 megahertz, which is colloquially known as GARD, on the GARD freak. Now, here's the big problem with this. Not a lot of civilian or general aviation aircraft monitor GARD. The FAA regulations state that you are required to monitor the emergency international distress frequency. You're required to monitor GARD if your aircraft has that capability. The problem is that no one really enforces it at all. And a lot of aircraft don't have multiple radios. So an aircraft who's flying around, the pilot is primarily going to be monitoring the airspace coordinator's frequency for wherever they are. So they're going to be talking to the tower, or whatever tower or airspace controller is controlling them through their flight. And that's not going to be the emergency frequency. Now, most general aviation aircraft nowadays have 2 radios, or they have a radio that has the ability to dual monitor. So I don't know what that's about, but I listen to a lot of aviation traffic, and I hear a lot of people just kind of either not monitor the emergency frequency, or they monitor it too much. So I have heard many times, and I know a lot of pilots can attest to this, is a pilot trying to hop on the international distress frequency to declare an emergency, right? And other people hop on the radio to tell them that they're on guard. You're on guard, And it's like, yeah, I know. I'm trying to transmit an emergency. So again, radio culture seems to transcend into the aviation community, to pilots actually experiencing an in-flight emergency, trying to use the emergency frequency, and people chastising them for using the emergency frequency. So I don't know. It's one of those kind of interesting cultural things, but I say all of that to say this is kind of important, because if a pilot fails to respond to military aircraft, right? So if they're not monitoring guard, if they're just flying around up there without a care in the world, and they're not monitoring guard, they're only monitoring the ground frequency for the airspace that they're in, sometimes a military pilot's not going to know what frequency they're on. So they're going to hit up the international frequency, 121.5, right? And here's the deal. If a pilot fails to respond to these radio calls, escalation of force is going to start taking place, right? So one of the things they're going to do is try to get on their wing, try to visually communicate with the aircraft via hand signals from cockpit to cockpit, and they're going to try to get really, really close and see if maybe there's a medical emergency. If this does happen, occasionally a pilot will get up there flying by themselves, and they'll have a heart attack or something, and their plane is still flying. And occasionally that does happen. It's unfortunate, but it does happen. So that's, again, one of the things we start working up towards an engagement, if you guys kind of follow where I'm going with this. So one of the next things is if a military aircraft gets off the wing of a civilian aircraft and they're not responding, they're not paying attention, they're either looking at their instruments, they're looking right off their dash, they're not looking off their wing. And one of the next things they're going to do is try to fly in front of that civilian aircraft and pop a few flares to get their attention. So now we starting to see this escalation of force kind of building up. Of course, military aircraft are not just going to go up there and shoot down a Cessna, right? That's not how this works. But you can see that this is a dangerous thing. We are kind of escalating towards this. And it kind of tells me that if at least the Air Force PAO who released these details, if they're saying the Air Force's testimony is that they had to pop flares in 2 of these interceptions, that tells me that they were working through a checklist of escalation of force, and they got pretty close to the bottom. So I guess this is probably one of those things where it's just, again, another call for situational awareness, especially among civilian pilots. A lot of people have been flying for many, many years, and unfortunately, a lot of people don't necessarily understand the times we're living in. They may think that it's just a great day for flying, and they don't understand that tensions are pretty high, especially in the national defense, sort of homeland defense kind of atmosphere. So a lot of people don't understand. They maybe they don't take the time to check for a NOTAM or flight restriction, temporary flight restriction, any kind of airspace closure. They don't check the NOTAMs before they fly. They're supposed to, but they don't. They're supposed to monitor the emergency frequency, but they don't. And this is dangerous. Okay, it's dangerous for them. It's dangerous for everybody else. So once again, just kind of an increased call for vigilance with that. So it's following the FAA's regulations for all the pilots out there, is, and being really on top of things, and not just being a kind of hotshot pilot out there in the general aviation sphere. Following these regulations as best you can, doing a little bit more, to try to be a little bit more situationally aware. This is not something that's just, a kind of paranoid thing to do. This might actually save your life. So again, something to kind of keep in mind. I thought it was kind of very interesting, especially when we've been talking a lot about risk and situational awareness lately. So that's pretty much all I have on that. Let's move over to Western Europe and talk about the Rearm Europe campaign, which has been recently announced or put into fruition over the past few days and weeks. All of this is coming really from the recent actions from President Trump in the White House to push back on European military defense spending. So once again, the United States is essentially making Europe pay for their own defense for once. Now, as I'll get to in a moment, this is a double-edged sword. But right now, the European Union is floating a very, very ambitious, really mostly impossible, but a very ambitious plan to invest 800 billion euro into a sort of collective defense kind of fund NATO sort of thing, but fund some nations not through NATO kind of thing. It's hard to explain, but it's really just a lot of European nations doing two things. They're increasing their own military defense spending budget for their own country, but they're also trying to put some money in the till for the collective defense of Europe. Now, how this is going to shake out, I don't know, but a lot of countries have announced very, very ambitious plans. Germany has announced to basically double their defense budget. Norway has decided to increase maritime operations in the Baltic Sea. They announced this weeks ago. Poland has announced that they are going to double their defense budget and double the size of their military too. So again, there are really big, ambitious plans being made, and I'm very curious as to see how the economic aspect of this is going to be handled as well, because someone's going to have to pay for this, and right now Europe is on the brink, just like the Western world, the Western civilization on the whole planet is essentially right on the brink of an economic disaster, and Europe decides, you know what we need to do? We need to spend even more. So I'm very curious as to see how this will shake out in the long run, but right now a lot of nations are rearming and essentially engaging in what they themselves call an arms race. Now, like I mentioned, this is kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, you really do want a nation to pay for its own defense. You know, if a nation is screaming and shouting about how, you know, please protect us, please save us kind of thing, Russia's a huge threat, well, invest in your own infrastructure. You know, maybe it would not be a super good idea to kill off all of your nuclear reactors, right, and then start buying oil and gas from Russia. You know, maybe that was not such a good idea. Energy is most certainly a national defense issue, right, going all the way back to Japan and Pearl Harbor. Oil, petroleum oil lubricant, this is a huge motivating factor for war a lot of times, even going back throughout history, and this is a huge thing. So on the one hand, it is good to see Europe kind of improving their defense situation for either their independent or for their shared defense. This is probably a good thing because the United States will be funding less of it. But on the other hand, most of these nations are very big warmongers. Like, they have got a lot of talk, and they have really tried to do everything they possibly can to get a war started. So NATO at large has, you know, just taking Russia out of it for a minute. I know that Russia gets painted as the aggressor a lot of times, and this is true in some regards, but just take Russia out of it for a moment. NATO, regardless of what Russia's doing, NATO by itself has a massive appetite for war with Russia. Forgetting anything that Russia may have done, NATO has really got a big appetite for war. So I think that if most NATO member states, if they had the armies that they want, they would have started a war already, either with Russia or with somebody else. They would have picked somebody. So Europe at large not being prepared or capable is the only thing that has held back World War III so far. You know, it takes two to tango, and Europe is absolutely not ready. They were not ready for the Ukrainian war, for one, but they're also not ready for the implications of what a peace deal might look like. So, yeah, it's going to be a very interesting time. Now, one of the things to remember, though, is that if Europe wants to rearm itself, it's going to take time. It's going to take a very long time. May even take a decade. Who knows? But these things just can't be conjured up out of thin air. You can print money out of thin air for sure, but you can't print artillery shells by adding a zero to a computer. It just doesn't work like that. You need to actually have the industrial capacity to rearm in any serious way. You know, you can't add a zero to a computer and just spring a human being into life. You have to have, you know, a fighting age male to fill your military. This is a generational thing, and right now not a lot of people in Western Europe are willing to fight for their nation. It's just the way that it is. This is what the data indicates. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how all of this works out over time, especially as it becomes harder and harder to sell the idea of Russia being an aggressor when there are terror attacks at home. We have a similar situation here in the United States, where we're constantly told by powerful people, governments even, that X or Y is a threat overseas, whereas we've got terror attacks occurring here at home. So as we have seen this week throughout Germany and Austria, there have been a lot of kinetic incidents that have occurred over the past few months. There was a deliberate terror attack in Mannheim that highlighted, well, who's the real enemy here? Like, maybe we should value homeland defense more than, defense from a foreign aggressor. But once again, these are all very subjective and very debatable things. What is palpable, however, is that people are definitely noticing that maybe a realignment of priorities would be in order. So with that, we have Europe rearming itself. How long will it take? Who knows? And what that rearming will look like is also anybody's guess. Everyone is spending money on defense, which is, on the one hand, a good thing because, homeland defense is one of the basic characteristics of a nation state, and it is one of the basic responsibilities of a government, right, to protect its people. However, it is also quite palpably obvious that the more that a nation is prepared for war, sometimes that is a motivator for getting into a war in the first place. So throughout some nations, the whole idea of peace through strength doesn't necessarily work out so well in terms of what political ideations are present throughout the ruling parties in some nations. So I guess we'll have to see how it works out. That's just kind of the way things are these days with these national, very big strategic things, but there's not a lot of good feelings going on throughout Europe with regards to the rearmament, but also the risks that their politicians are bringing to the table, and whether or not they're actually serious about rearming, or if this is all just smoke and mirrors like usual. So we shall see how things work out. So wrapping things up today with the GhostNet, again, a very good week for GhostNet Reports. Just as a reminder, we are coming up on daylight savings again, so for those of you, don't forget, like me, half the time, I forget that daylight savings occurs, and for many of us who live in areas that actually go by daylight savings, the timeline will shift. So again, the GhostNet Reports on Thursday night is, at least for me, in Eastern time, it's 8 p.m. in the wintertime and 9 p.m. In the summertime, so it will shift forward by an hour. Again, not all U.S. states go by daylight savings, so keeping things in sort of UTC time is a little bit more helpful for the global audience. So yeah, just as a reminder, we're going to be shifting a little bit later with the daylight saving shift. So that's pretty much all I have for today. I thank you guys all for watching. Here are the sources for this week. Once again, you can get all the sources and paperwork, all you want from my Obsidian page as usual. And the slides for this briefing will be on Patreon just like usual. You can download them in PDF form. So that's pretty much all I have for today. Thank you guys all for watching. Thank you for your support, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.